I hope my channel has proven that you don't need coilovers or an aftermarket K-member to make your 79 to 04 Mustang a competitive autocross car. The myth that our Mustangs can't handle without those mods has been around for decades. In fact, there's no shortage of myths about what a Mustang needs to be able to carve corners around cones. I've made it my mission to get as many 79 to 04 Mustangs as possible out on an autocross course. So I made this video to discuss the myths I hear most often about Mustang autocross mods and debunk them with facts. Myth number 1. My Mustang needs to be as low as possible. We're trained to associate ride height with handling. After all, race cars are low to the ground. Lowering springs are a really popular mod, and they're often the first change people make to their Mustangs. There are many options out there, and a lot of people assume that the lower they go, the better their car will handle. And while it is true that a lower center of gravity does improve handling, going too low limits suspension travel, and increases your chances of hitting the bump stops when your suspension articulates. And trust me, your suspension will articulate out on an autocross course. When you run out of suspension travel, your spring rate essentially goes to infinity. You can run into problems with instant and aggressive understeer or oversteer, and that can lead to losing control. Autocross courses are rarely as smooth as racetracks. Most of the time, you're in a parking lot or on an old airport runway. If your springs don't allow your tires to go down into dips or up over bumps, or your car is so low that it bottoms out on course, your tires will lose contact with the surface, and that will upset the car. Bump steer can also be a side effect of going too low. Bump steer is an undesirable toe change resulting from articulation of the suspension and steering. Basically, the suspension is steering the car without input from the driver. But this consequence of lowering your car can be solved with a properly adjusted bump steer kit. The fact is, 79 to 04 Mustangs, especially those that aren't running coilovers, handle better on an autocross course when they sit slightly lower than stock, not when they're slammed to the ground. If you're looking into lowering springs for your autocross build, make sure you don't go too low. And, just to be clear, you can autocross your Mustang with stock springs. Myth number 2. My Mustang suspension needs to be super stiff. Myth number 2 is tied into the first myth because springs that are too low are usually too stiff. But in many cases, what makes 79 to 04 Mustangs too stiff for attacking the cones are the shocks and struts people choose. There's a reason this myth persists. Just about every non-adjustable aftermarket performance shock and strut is advertised as an upgrade that tightens or stiffens up your suspension for better handling. But when you stiffen up your shocks and struts too much, they can make it harder for the suspension to do its job, especially when entering and exiting corners. This leads to understeer and oversteer, and 79 to 04 Mustangs don't need any additional understeer and oversteer. A car that's too stiff gets to the limit of traction much sooner. It can feel like it's driving on ice. Aggressive steering and throttle inputs can lead to, you guessed it, son of a, losing control on course. The fact is, installing super stiff aftermarket shocks and struts can often do more harm than good. 79 to 04 Mustang shocks and struts need to have a certain amount of squish to maintain grip in twisty elements. How much varies depending on every other suspension mod you make. Because going too stiff or going too soft can negatively affect your handling, your best option is to use adjustable shocks and struts to be able to find the sweet spot for your specific setup. Myth number 3. My Mustang needs more power. The fastest autocross car I own is my 220 horsepower 2004 Mustang V6. None of my cars has more than 300 horsepower, and they've all put up better times than cars with more horsepower. Autocross is not a horsepower game. Yes, you do need some power to move a 3,000 plus pound car around the course, but it's often not as much as people think. If your 400 horsepower Mustang isn't as fast as you want it to be your first time out, the solution is not another 100 horsepower. The fact is, most 79 to 04 Mustangs have enough horsepower for autocross. Because it's not about how much power you have, it's about how much power you can actually use, and how effectively you as the driver can manage that power. Myth number 4. My Mustang needs massive rear tires. Many modern performance cars and supercars have larger tires in the rear, commonly called a staggered setup. Sometimes the rear tires are 70 to 100 millimeters wider than the front tires. Staggered wheels are an extremely popular mod for 79 to 04 Mustangs. But the difference between modern performance cars and supercars and our Mustangs is that those cars were designed to work with a staggered setup, and our cars weren't. A staggered setup creates understeer. Wider tires in the rear give the car more rear grip, but the smaller tires up front can't match that level of grip. That hurts the overall handling of the car. The fact is, a square setup, using the same size tires front and rear, is the best choice when choosing bigger rims and tires for autocross. And remember, 79 to 04 Mustangs came with the same size rims and tires on all four corners, so if you've stuck with the OEM tire size, you have a square setup. Myth number 5. My Mustang needs 373 rear gears. It feels like every novice I've ever instructed in a 79 to 04 Mustang has asked me if they need 373 rear gears. It's the go-to rear-end ratio to give our cars aggressive acceleration. A lower rear gear, one that's higher numerically, will increase acceleration. And of course, autocrossers love acceleration. But the trade-off for better acceleration is lower top speed. And that lower top speed happens in every gear. A lot of people don't consider their top speed in second gear at the red line when choosing rear gears. The SCCA says autocross courses are limited to highway speeds of around 55 to 60 miles per hour. But that top speed varies because no two courses are the same. So to give yourself a cushion, you want a rear gear ratio that allows you to get as close to 65 miles per hour as possible at the top of second gear, while still giving you good acceleration. These charts give you a ballpark for our Mustangs. If your car redlines at 5,500 RPM, running 355s will put you right around 63 miles per hour at the rev limiter. But 373 rear gears will force you to shift into third gear around 60 miles per hour. You can choose not to shift, but that 3 miles per hour makes a big difference on a 50-second course. If you do shift into third, you'll have to downshift back into second gear in the slower parts of the course. And every shift will cost you time. Your rear gear ratio also impacts traction as you roll on the gas. If the slightest touch of the throttle makes your rear tires spin, you will lose time going sideways. In autocross, a tenth of a second could mean the difference between first and second place. More acceleration doesn't help if it creates less grip. The fact is, you need to find the rear gear ratio that provides the best balance of acceleration and top speed in second gear. For some of you, that might mean sticking with the stock rear gear ratio. On my cars, 355 rear gears top out at 63 miles per hour in second. If your engine has a 6,500 RPM redline but less low-end torque, you might want to use 373s. And if you only run on short courses where the top speeds are closer to 55 miles per hour, and you won't get anywhere near your red line with 355s, you might want to consider 373s. The most important thing to know about rear gears is that they're not a one-size-fits-all mod. I've heard these myths ever since I started autocrossing. I instruct a lot of novices who've made these mods and they end up fighting their setup out on course. Even worse, I talk to Mustang owners at car shows and club meetings who want to autocross, but they haven't because they think they need these mods in order to be competitive. If you're watching this video and you're on the fence about autocrossing your stock Mustang, or you're thinking about building an autocross Mustang, don't believe the myths. Your pony doesn't have to be slammed to the ground and be super stiff, or have ungodly amounts of horsepower, massive rear tires, and rear gears that can launch it into space. The fact is, the best way to determine what mods your Mustang needs for autocross is to just give it a try.